From the day the infection began, the world was never the same. It had started with a few cases here and there, but then it spread quickly, turning people into the walking dead. People had tried to contain it, but it was too late. The infection had spread, taking over the world, and leaving a wake of destruction in its wake. My name was John, and I had been one of the lucky ones. I had managed to survive the initial outbreak, but it had been a hard fight. I had seen friends and family turn into monsters, and I had seen horrors that would haunt me for the rest of my life. But I had managed to stay alive, and I had vowed to keep fighting, no matter what. It had been several weeks since the infection began, and I was now alone. The world I once knew was gone, and I was the last living human I knew of. I had managed to scavenge enough food and supplies to keep myself going, but it was a struggle. Everywhere I went, I was surrounded by the undead, and I had to be constantly on my guard. I had been pushing my luck lately, venturing out further and further from my safe haven. I had found a few useful things, but the further I went, the more dangerous it became. I was starting to get careless, and I knew it. I had to be more careful, or I would end up like so many of the others. One day, while out scavenging, I stumbled upon a group of survivors. They were holed up in an abandoned warehouse, and they had managed to build a makeshift barricade to keep the undead out. I was relieved to see other people, and I was determined to join them. Unfortunately, they weren't too keen on the idea. They had just barely managed to survive, and they weren't about to risk their lives by letting me in. They had seen too many people turn, and they weren't willing to take the risk. I tried to plead my case, but it was no use. I was about to give up, when one of the survivors stepped forward. He told me that they had seen me in the area, and that he knew I was a survivor. He said that if I could prove myself, they would let me in. He gave me a simple task: kill a zombie. At first, I was hesitant. I had never killed a zombie before, and I wasn't sure if I could do it. But I knew that if I wanted to survive, I had to do it. Taking a deep breath, I grabbed a nearby metal pipe and charged the nearest zombie. The zombie was fast, but I was quicker. I managed to dodge its clumsy swings, and I delivered a powerful blow to its head. It crumpled to the ground, and I was relieved to see that it was dead. I had done it. The other survivors were impressed, and they welcomed me into their group. We worked together, and over time, we managed to build a safe community. We scavenged for supplies, built makeshift weapons, and worked together to stay alive. I had found a new family, and I was determined to do whatever it took to protect them. We had to stay strong, and we had to fight for our future. We had no idea what the future held, but we were determined to survive. We had been living in the warehouse for several months, and it was starting to feel like home. We had managed to survive, and we were slowly rebuilding our lives. But one day, it all changed. We heard a loud noise coming from outside. We rushed to the windows, and what we saw changed everything. There, in the distance, was a group of survivors. They were armed and organized, and they were coming for us. We quickly barricaded the warehouse, and we prepared for a fight. But we were outnumbered and outgunned. We had no chance against them. We were about to give up hope, when I had an idea. I grabbed a few of the survivors, and we snuck out a back entrance. We managed to make it to a nearby farmhouse, and we barricaded ourselves inside. We had no weapons, but we had a plan. We had heard stories of a group of survivors living in an old military base. If we could make it there, we might have a chance. So, without any weapons, we set out for the military base. It was a long and dangerous journey, but eventually, we made it. The base was heavily guarded, but the guards welcomed us with open arms. We had made it. We were safe. The group at the base had managed to create a safe haven. They had weapons and supplies, and they had managed to hold off the undead. We were all safe now, and we could finally start to rebuild. It had been a long and hard journey, but we had made it. We had survived the zombie apocalypse, against all odds. The sun shone through the trees, casting shadows across the forest floor. The birds were singing, and the trees were swaying in the breeze. It was a beautiful day, but all Melinda could think about was the impending doom of the zombie apocalypse. The world as she knew it had changed drastically over the past few weeks. The virus had spread quickly, turning the living into the undead. It was a fight for survival, and Melinda knew she had to be prepared if she was going to make it. She had been on the move for days, never staying in one place for too long. Everywhere she went, she saw death and destruction. The dead walked the streets, and the living were few and far between. Melinda had been lucky so far. She had managed to find food and shelter, and she had managed to avoid the zombies. But she knew that her luck wouldn't last forever. So she kept on the move, staying one step ahead of the undead. She had a plan to make it to safety, but she knew it was a long shot. She had heard stories of people who had made it to the mountains, where they were safe from the zombies. But she also knew that it was a difficult journey, and the odds were against her. Nevertheless, she was determined to make it. She had to try. So Melinda set off on her journey. She collected whatever supplies she could, and she kept her weapons close at hand. She was ready for whatever the world threw at her. The first few days of the journey were uneventful, but as she got closer to the mountains, the zombie numbers seemed to increase. She had to move quickly and stay alert. One day, she was walking through a field when she heard a noise behind her. She spun around and saw a horde of zombies coming towards her. She had no time to run, so she quickly grabbed her gun and aimed it at the nearest zombie. She fired, and the zombie dropped to the ground. But the others kept coming. She fired again and again, taking out zombie after zombie. Finally, she ran out of bullets and had to retreat. She managed to make it to a nearby farmhouse, where she barricaded the doors and windows. She stayed in the farmhouse for days, waiting for the zombie horde to pass. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they moved on. Relieved, Melinda continued on her journey. She was tired and scared, but she was determined to make it to the mountains. Finally, after weeks of travel, she made it. The mountains were a safe haven from the zombie hordes, and she was relieved to be there. But her journey wasn't over yet. She still had to find a way to survive. She would have to make her own shelter, find food, and defend herself against the undead. It was a daunting task, but Melinda was up for the challenge. She had made it this far, and she was determined to make it through the zombie apocalypse. She gathered wood and built a small shelter. She foraged for food and made weapons from whatever she could find. She was ready for whatever came her way. And, as the days passed, she began to make a life for herself in the mountains. She was safe from the undead, and she was determined to make it through this apocalypse. Melinda had come a long way since the start of the zombie apocalypse. She had faced danger and survived. She had found shelter and food. She had fought off the undead and she had made it to safety. She was a survivor. It had been 2 weeks since the zombie apocalypse had started and the world had changed. 5 people were struggling to survive. The first of them was Tom, a 26-year-old mechanic from the Midwest. He was the leader of the group, always thinking 2 steps ahead to keep everyone safe. Tom was always calm and collected no matter the situation, able to think clearly and logically without panicking or getting too emotional. The second person was Sarah, a 33-year-old nurse from the East Coast. She was the medic of the group, always taking care of her friends and making sure everyone was healthy and safe. Sarah was always compassionate and understanding, often looking out for the welfare of others before her own. The third person was Ryan, a 25-year-old soldier from the South. He was the muscle of the group, always on the lookout for potential danger and ready to fight. Ryan was always brave and determined, never hesitating to put himself in harm's way to protect his friends. The fourth person was Martin, a 28-year-old engineer from the West. He was the brains of the group, always coming up with creative solutions to the problems they faced. Martin was always quick-witted and sharp, able to think outside the box and come up with solutions in a pinch. The fifth and final person was Amanda, a 24-year-old artist from the north. She was the moral compass of the group, always pushing them to do the right thing and helping them stay focused on the bigger picture. Amanda was always passionate and inspiring, motivating the group to reach their goals no matter the odds. Together, the 5 of them had become a family. They looked out for each other, and worked together to survive in this new zombie-filled world. They had found an abandoned house in the middle of nowhere, and decided to stay there for the time being. It wasn't the most comfortable or luxurious of places, but it was safe, and out of the way. They were able to barricade the doors and windows, and make it their base of operations. The group quickly got to work. Tom and Ryan took turns keeping watch while Sarah cooked, Martin worked on weapons and defenses, and Amanda took care of morale. It was a long and grueling process, but they were determined to make it work. As days turned into weeks, they slowly got more used to the idea of living in a zombie-filled world. They had to be careful when going outside and always had to be on the lookout for danger. But in the end, they had made it. They had found a safe place to call home and had survived the first 2 weeks of the zombie apocalypse. The rest of the group was relieved, but Tom and Ryan were already thinking ahead. They knew that this was only the beginning and that they had to remain vigilant and prepared for whatever the future may bring. The 5 of them continued to live in their makeshift home, taking small trips outside to scavenge for supplies. They would often find other survivors along the way, and Tom and Ryan would always be ready to lend a helping hand. Life was far from perfect, but it was manageable. The 5 of them had become a self-sustaining family, and that made all the difference. They had come a long way since the zombie apocalypse had started, and even though they had lost so much, they had also gained something too. They had each other, and in a world full of zombies, that was all that mattered. The world had changed. The zombie apocalypse had begun, and there was no going back. 5 people remained and were determined to survive. The first was Cora, a strong and brave, 21-year-old woman who had been the leader of the group since the beginning. She was the one who had taken charge, and the group was grateful for her courage and guidance. The second was Evan, a 22-year-old man who had been Cora's best friend since childhood. He was always ready to lend a hand, and could be counted on for ideas and support. The third was Lena, a 30-year-old woman who had joined the group a few weeks after the outbreak. She had been a nurse before the apocalypse, and was now the group's medic. The fourth was Jordan, a 25-year-old man who had been a soldier before the outbreak. He was the group's protector, and was always ready to fight for their safety. The fifth was Nick, a 20-year-old man who had been a student before the outbreak. He was the group's tech expert, and had been able to figure out how to keep their communication and transportation running. The first 10 days passed without incident. Cora was the leader, and she kept them focused and determined. They managed to find food and supplies and make it through the first 10 days. The next 10 days were more difficult. The group had to stay on the move to avoid the zombies, and they were running low on supplies. They had to scavenge for whatever they could find, but they managed to get by. The next 10 days were a little easier. The group had found a safe place to hide, and they were able to lay low and rest. They were able to find better supplies and get a few hours of sleep. The next 10 days were the hardest. The zombies had been getting closer, and the group had to keep moving. They were constantly on the lookout for food and supplies, and they had to be careful not to be seen. The next 10 days were a little easier, as the group had found a large house that was safe and secure. They were able to rest and regroup, and they were able to get some much-needed rest. The next 10 days were a little more difficult. The zombies had been getting closer, and the group had to move again. They were running low on supplies and had to scavenge for whatever they could find, but they managed to make it through. The next 10 days were a little easier. The group had managed to find a large warehouse that was safe and secure. They were able to rest and regroup, and they were able to get some much-needed rest. The next 10 days were a little more difficult. The zombies had been getting closer, and the group had to move again. They were running low on supplies and had to scavenge for whatever they could find, but they managed to make it through. The next 10 days were a little easier. The group had managed to find a large farm that was safe and secure. They were able to rest and regroup, and they were able to get some much-needed rest. The last 10 days were the most difficult. The zombies had been getting closer, and the group had to move again. They were running low on supplies and had to scavenge for whatever they could find, but they managed to make it through. Finally, after 100 days, the group had made it. They had found a safe place to live and had managed to survive the zombie apocalypse. It had been a long and difficult journey, but they had made it. As they looked around at each other, they all shared a sense of relief that they had made it through. They were alive and they were together. They had survived.